Welcome to God is Better Than You Think. This is a YouTube channel and podcast in which I interview each week an underrepresented voice in Christianity, someone who has a point of view that I think is really important and also often missing in the dialogues surrounding Christianity, specifically in America. If you have been regularly watching or listening to this, I would love it if you are watching on YouTube, if you would subscribe, if you are listening to the podcast, if you would rate, review, and subscribe. All that stuff helps me keep doing this as the word gets out there more and the audience grows. So please, the reason that this exists is I got an email recently from someone who was just talking about how one of the guests I had on here, how she felt validated in her spiritual journey toward Jesus from the interview. And she felt as though it affirmed things that she had been going through and experiencing. And that's really probably the goal of why I'm doing this. At least one of them is to try to help people realize that their questions, their point of view, some of the complications they might feel in their spiritual journeys, that all of that stuff is normal and there's a place for it. And the good news is that God is better than we think, that there is that God is more than we have often made him out to be. Today's guest is going to be Becky Castle-Miller. She was one of the first people I reached out to interview. Took us a while to set it up because she was repatriating, moving back to the States. She's finishing up her master's thesis and talking about psychology, specifically psychology of emotions and theology, and how so often Christianity has misunderstood both the psychology and the theology of emotions in ways that are very harmful, but that the good news is that God is actually much kinder and more interested in our emotional world than oftentimes even we are. And so enough of me, let's get to Becky. Oh man, but seriously, how are you? You moved, across the world to come back to the United States during a pandemic. How was that?
It wasn't as bad as I feared it would be, which I feel really positive answer, right? So we were living in the Netherlands for 8 years.
Yeah.
2 youngest kids were born there. So that's all my family knows. My oldest is 13, so she doesn't really remember life before we moved either. So This was a huge change for us. We've been thinking about the move for 3 years. We've been planning it for a year, but in none of that did we expect there would be a global pandemic in the middle of our international move.
I don't think you're the only one in the world.
So it definitely affected everything from can we fly? Like, we really weren't sure we could get tickets. We had trouble getting our household goods shipped. Thankfully, we found a shipper that could do it and could clear customs. So this is my basement with absolutely no furniture in it because our household goods don't arrive until August 28th at the earliest.
No.
We're kind of camping out in our new house with suitcases. But we got tickets, and then one of the next biggest challenge was we have 2 cats. And for some reason, pandemic airline stuff has disrupted pet travel. So like pet transport services were not running and most airlines wouldn't take them in the cargo hold. And so we finally found one airline that would let us take them as in-cabin pets. So we had our cats like in these soft-sided carriers, like under the seats in front of us, like meowing for the entire 8-hour transit. But with all of that, we're here. We survived it.
Right.
In the Netherlands, they got the pandemic under control pretty quickly with a really hasty lockdown that was pretty strict at first. And so by the time we left, my kids were back in school. Church was meeting in person. We actually were able to have a going away party and say goodbye to our friends in person. So to come here and go back into like strict lockdown, masks everywhere, kids can't go to school, was like going back in time.
Oh gosh. So yeah. So you're telling me it's possible for a country to handle it a little better than maybe we did.
It worked in a lot of Europe. Going back to normal there. People, well, a lot of it was a social safety net. People could close down their business because then they would get small business support from the government. And so they could afford to close their business for 3 months. and people stayed indoors, and it worked. They're not even wearing masks. They never actually did a mask mandate in the Netherlands. They did in France, but not in the Netherlands. So it's weird. I mean, we moved into a new community that we were so excited about. We chose a house that would be great for hospitality, and we can't like meet our neighbors or have anyone over. So this is really a weird time to move and to get set up in a new life.
Man, well, I mean, several things. First of all, sorry. Second of all, welcome, and I'm glad everyone's safe. And third, thank you for making time to talk with me. It's so nice of you. I've been following you on Twitter for a little while now. That's like kind of the theme of like almost everyone I've had on this is like someone that I'm like, I found them on Twitter and I thought they were pretty interesting, and then found excuses to talk to them. Why did you guys move back? Like, what prompted the decision to move back from the Netherlands to here?
Man, a lot of things. But the biggest thing is a question mark. I don't really know. So like 3 years ago, I was in Wheaton, which is where we are now, visiting because I just finished my Master of Arts at Northern Seminary, which is just down the road in Lisle. And my husband's aunt and uncle live here in Wheaton. They're the rectors of an Anglican church. And so every time I came back for my summer intensive for my Northern program, I just should explain for people who don't know. So in the Netherlands, I was doing an online program at Northern Seminary to get my seminary degree. So my classes were at 11 p.m. my time zone. And so I did 4 years of basically night classes for me because of the time difference in a live classroom online. But I came to the Chicagoland area for my summer intensives. So I've been in the past few years. One of my first couple of years here, I was on my way to the airport, and Uncle Kevin was driving me, and he said, I think you'd be really interested in the three streams Anglicanism that we're involved in. We're charismatic, we're evangelical, and we're liturgical. And I was like, well, that's everything I'm looking for in a tradition. And I kind of knew at that moment 3 years ago, God's going to call us to Wheaton, isn't he? I had that sense, and that sense of calling grew stronger over the next 3 years. My husband got on board with it. And so that sense of God wants us here for some reason that we're not sure what it is. So we are closer to family. And my husband was offered a job a year ago that would allow him to work remote from Wheaton. And they paid for our relocation, which was a really clear confirmation that God was going to provide for us to move back.
Right.
And just more and more circumstances started working out that made it clear that this is where we're supposed to be, but we don't know what. I don't have a job lined up. I had a job interview yesterday. Hopefully that works out. We'll see. I'd love to do a PhD at Wheaton College, but I need to do some language courses first. So it's a sense of God's call. We feel like we're being called into Anglicanism as a family, like we're going to make that huge tradition transition along with this. That's our first time in a liturgical church, but we don't really know. And now we can't, what do we even do? What do we do in our community? What do we do in ministry? We can't leave our house. So I don't understand what God's doing.
So that's amazing. A lot of questions based on what you just said already, but one of them is, why did you decide? Well, what kind of Christian tradition did you find yourself in before, and why did you decide to switch to more of an Anglican stream?
Okay. I feel like a theological mutt, and I don't think that phrase is original to me. I've heard it elsewhere, but a theological mutt, a mixed breed. My dad is a pastor, has been in a lot of non-denominational churches. My dad is an Army chaplain. So I've been in Army chapels all over the world, and we've also visited a lot of churches and been in many different, mostly in the Pentecostal, charismatic, non-denominational space, spent a lot of time in Assemblies of God churches. One time when I was probably 15, my family visited an Episcopal church for just a few weeks, but it made a huge impact on me. I loved the dark paneling and the red carpet and the pews and the incense and the prayer of confession. And I loved the liturgy. So that has always stuck with me as something that was incredibly appealing, though I never went to any liturgical churches as an adult. And I was on staff at an international church in the Netherlands that had people from over 100 different nations. So I was exposed to a lot of traditions there as well. And we were such a mixed bag as a church. We were loosely Assemblies of God, but very trying to accommodate a lot of traditions. And especially studying with Scott McKnight at Northern Seminary, who is Anglican and made that transition himself a few years ago. And my mentor, Karen Miller, who is my husband's aunt, who lives here in Wheaton, she's been my leadership coach, pastoral leadership coach for the past 3 or 4 years. So hearing her influence, hearing Scott's influence, and just feeling very drawn to it, it made sense to me for a lot of reasons.
So you're just falling squarely in that old cliche of charismatic Anglican, huh?
Hang on a second. I asked the kids not to interrupt me. Sorry about that. I told them they can go watch whatever they want on YouTube as long as they don't come downstairs.
So 2 things. One is I can absolutely cut that out. And 2 is I'm so glad I'm not the only one. Like, I don't have 5 kids like you do, but we have 2, and they're 6 and about to turn 4. And it's just kind of the same thing. And and we're in like a 2-bedroom apartment. And yeah, the only reason.
We have a
Go ahead.
bedroom house, 3 floors, and I don't know why they just downstairs is. You guys, I literally built them a bunk bed yesterday with a slide on it. Like, go play on your bunk bed slide, guys.
They have a bunk bed slide?
Yes.
I want a bunk bed slide.
Right.
That's some solid momming. Way to go, by the way. Okay, so I was saying, so you're one of those classic charismatic Anglicans, which actually I've known quite a few. I don't know how many people know this. That's actually like there's a lot of crossover between the charismatic and Vineyard traditions and Anglican. It's like people who are really into the Holy Spirit and really like liturgy. It sounds like that's kind of the camp you fall in.
Exactly. And so I'll be in the C4SO diocese. So Bishop Todd Hunter actually was a Vineyard pastor before becoming Anglican, and now he's our bishop. So there's absolutely that tradition transfer there as well.
Which is interesting to like you and me and like 5 other people who are watching this, but you know what? It's my thing and I get to talk about what I want. So first of all, you said that your dad was a chaplain in the Army, I think you said. And I saw, as I was doing a little bit of research on you, I saw that you said you lived in 25 different places by the time you were 25 years old.
Yes.
What was that like growing up that way? And what are some of the positives that came from that? And then some of the things that you would be like, and there was this consequence as well.
Right. I mean, the positives were I can make a home anywhere. I feel very content with housing. It was actually hard to look for a house here in Wheaton for a number of reasons. We couldn't come and visit in person. Like when we were house searching in March, the whole world was locked down. There was no airline travel. So we bought this house like sight unseen. So that was wild. But like looking for a house was hard because I don't care. I mean, I do care. I care a lot, but I can make a home anywhere. I'm used to living in military housing that we kind of had to make the best of. So that's good and bad. Yeah, I can live anywhere, but sometimes I don't really know what my own preference is with housing. It's like the Julia Roberts movie, The Runaway Bride. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's running gag through the whole thing where she doesn't know what type of eggs she likes because she's always adapted herself to the men that she's with. And she doesn't know her own preferences. I kind of feel like that. Like growing up in the Army, I don't know what I like sometimes because I just had to make do with what we had. So that's maybe an unexpected consequence of it.
No, 100%. I've never thought about that before. And you grew up in a Christian home, a Christian tradition, Christian faith. So many of us, I mean, very much me, as we, and I noticed just, and even like, I was like, oh, we were born within like 2 months of each other. So we, may have experienced very different things, but a very similar timeline. And I feel like one of the things that tends to happen is you start developing a little bit of a complicated relationship with your faith tradition. Have you had any of that stuff where you started going back and looking through things and being like, wait a minute, what was that? Like, how do I feel about that? Have you had any of those moments?
Yeah, absolutely. I would also point out another similarity is obviously we have the same dress code. I'm just like the black V-neck T-shirt on. Like we match pretty well. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you got my note about that.
Right. Of course.
I insist that all of my guests dress exactly.
Wear black. Okay.
You didn't shave your head. I was kind of disappointed about that.
And I didn't grow a beard either. So the military thing, like having to move all over the world, uproot, lose friends, lose community. But then the Christian element of that was like saying, not only do we go where the army sends us, but we go where God sends us, because my parents had a real sense of mission and ministry. But that also kind of got all messed up in my head, is like, God is forcing me to uproot and move. And that kind of gets messed up in my God concept sometimes, of like, God did this to me sort of thing. So I learned to subjugate my own wants and desires for the sense of doing what God wanted. But I think I took it to pretty unhealthy levels, not knowing any better, to almost feel like anything I wanted must be bad. And anything that felt comfortable or unpleasant or unwanted must be what God wants.
Yeah.
So God is always going to make me miserable, but I'm going to do it anyway because I really love God and I want to obey God.
Right. It's like that, like, I mean, now like, there was like later on, like getting sent to Africa became like the cool thing to do. But I remember growing up, it's like, God's going to send you to that place you really don't want to go. Like, so just brace yourself, because that's what he's going to do to you.
So I think there was a lot of that in the American evangelical teenage youth group culture, in a lot of the books that we were reading and a lot of the sermons we were hearing. And then I got kind of a double dose of that, being a military kid and a pastor's kid. So that messed me up pretty badly emotionally. And I never processed my grief from all the homesickness and all the losses until I was in my 20s. In my 20s, I had a major emotional breakdown, partly due to postpartum depression that was undiagnosed, but partly due to just decades of accumulated grief that I didn't even think I was allowed to feel or process. And it all hit me at once, and I just fell apart. And I've learned since then, that whole breakdown was probably what launched me into the academic work I'm doing on emotion and emotion in the Gospels. Was my own inability to feel my emotions and to process my emotions.
Yeah, I resonate with that. I didn't bounce around and move like you did, but I resonate so much with what you're talking about. Because like it was this idea that, and it seemed like it was built on something real or perceived. The church was perceiving at least some sort of threat, the threat of postmodernism or liberalism or whatever. And it was kind of this like, whatever you feel, whatever you want to do kind of thing. And so there's this backlash of like, feelings are bad. And so, and what sucks is like, and not everyone's like this, but I'm like, so if you're in Enneagram stuff, I'm a 4, which means I feel things deeply. And I'm also always on the search of like trying to figure out what I'm actually feeling. And I'm wired. So me and feelings are just tied together, whether I want them to be or not. It's like that runs so deeply for me. And so I was this person who's being told emotions are dangerous and they cannot rule you, who is a deeply emotional person. And so it's like, it's complicated, right? And so you have this very complicated relationship with your own self. And so for you, do you feel like even with like the postpartum depression was part of the reason that was undiagnosed, because that would have required you realizing you were depressed and you just didn't have language for that?
Oof. Well, there's a lot of questions and statements that I want to respond to in that.
Oh, please, sorry.
Hopefully understanding as a 4, I can't imagine how hard that was. I'm an 8. With 9 wing. So I'm a leader. I like to take charge. I like to be like bold and confronting, and but then I'm also like, I've got the peacemaker wing. So I have this like constant internal conflict of like, I want to like break down the oppressive systems, but I don't want anyone to be mad at me when I do it, which is challenging. So
yeah, I want to be authentic to everything I'm feeling, but I also really, really want people to accept me when I'm being authentic.
Right. So that's, Enneagram has been really helpful as a self-understanding tool. Oh man. Yeah, so much to respond to on that. That whole thing you're saying about emotions being forbidden. That's really the main point of the thesis chapter that I'm finishing right now. I did a survey, just a casual survey of about 40 or so acquaintances from around the world. on what they learned about emotions growing up Christian, and how what they learned damaged them. What books they read or sermons they heard or what messages they got about their feelings. And one of the biggest themes that came through in that was that emotions are not to be trusted.
Yes, word for word.
Right. Exactly. Don't trust your emotions.
Not just the concept. The words you just said are like seared into my brain. Emotions are not to be trusted. Exactly.
Your emotions will lead you astray. Your emotions are just the devil tempting you away from God. Your emotions will lead you into sin. And so this whole, like, I understand where our parents and our pastors, when we were kids, were coming from. There was a fear of sin. Yeah. We don't want to sin. We want to be a holy people. And I can totally relate to that. As a pastor, I can relate to like not wanting people that I'm shepherding to walk away from God, not wanting them to sin, not wanting them to make bad decisions. Like I can understand the shepherding heart behind that. But it takes an entire misunderstanding of what emotions are and the purpose of God creating us with emotions. And when you start from bad science and bad theology, you're going to end up with destructive consequences.
Oh, that's our quote. That's like the little snippet for this episode right there, what you just said. Oh my gosh. Okay, so when you said bad science and bad theology, let's just dive in.
Okay.
You seem to be suggesting that there is a fundamental failure to understand emotion on just about every core level within at least some of Christianity or evangelical Christianity. How? Yeah. So what are we getting wrong? What are we missing?
everything. And that's it. That's the point. And so I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a budding theologian. And so, having only just gotten into this research for the past couple of years, I can't say I'm an expert, but I read a lot on emotional health. Mm-hmm. This is what my master's thesis is on that I'm wrapping up now. In short, there's two sides of the argument that I make. We've got the science wrong and we've got the theology wrong. We've got the Bible wrong on emotion. So the science piece is that a lot of the teaching on emotion in the church comes from more like Enlightenment philosophy, and also even going back further, like a lot of Gnosticism.
Yep.
And early church heresies. So we're drawing from old, outdated ideas on emotion, not the current neuroscientific research on emotion. And I know that some Christians are going to stop me right there because, like, we can't trust science because science is secular, right? So, like, I realize there's a whole bunch of people who are going to stop listening to me at that point when I say, hey, we need to look to science. So with that said, I think
listening to anything I do at this point in time. I think they've kind of gotten tired of hearing me talk about that. But no, you're right. But like, isn't it true that like we're operating off of some sort of scientific idea, whether we realize it or not? There's a science floating back there somewhere, even if we haven't articulated it.
Right, and the science that we've been operating off of in the church is science that's been disproven. So the universal theory of emotion is the idea that we are born with emotion as an inborn part of us, that there are basic universal human emotions that are the same across cultures that come out of us unbidden and unwarranted and unwanted and uncontrollable. And so we need to fight really hard to tamp down these emotional urges because they're destructive. Well, that's out of Greco-Roman philosophy right there, that we need to fight the passions and we need to control the passions to be logical. And then you go into Enlightenment thinking and Stoicism. Yeah. We need to be in the Enlightenment, like we need to be rational, not given to emotional passion.
Right.
But all of those ideas are really articulated in the theory of universal emotion. And Dr. Paul Ekman is one of the leading voices on that. He did a lot of work, also Dr. Tompkins. So in the 60s and 70s, they did a lot of work, experiments on universal emotion, trying to prove that there are inborn, consistent human emotions across all cultures and all times, and that there are physical markers that can show those emotions. So consistent facial expressions that go with those, consistent body responses or parts of the brain even that light up when we're having certain emotions. So a newer researcher named Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett has done some new work over the past 10 years. She went back and redid a lot of Ekman's experiments and found the flaws in them and has disproven them. Wow. So the latest theory that's coming out in neuroscience and psychology is that emotion is constructed. Okay. So she said, we are the architect of our own experience. Our emotions are a complicated brain response to what we're experiencing. And it's our brain both predicting what's going to happen and preparing for it, and then responding to what's happening. And then with all of our culture and history that's built into us, our stereotypical emotional responses that we think we're allowed to have according to our culture, all of that is coming together to construct our emotion in any given moment.
Okay.
But the whole idea of separating rationality from emotion is flawed, because all parts of our thinking go together. Like, it is rational to predict and respond. So that like, we don't separate rationality and emotionality. They are all part of the same process that's creating our response to what's happening in us. And our emotions are preparing us to take action toward our goals. Our emotions show what our priorities are and help us reach them. Our emotions are in some ways largely cultural and linguistic. So different cultures have and experience and express different emotions because the cultural constructs and linguistic concepts that go into it are different. So I could go into a lot more detail, but that's the basic idea. So it's universal emotion, uncontrollable emotion versus constructed emotion that we actually have a lot more control over than we think.
So that was going to be my next question. Why does that matter? And so part of it is that there's a control. Emotions aren't these uncontrollable forces at work on us.
Yes, that we need to like resist or fight against.
Right. We have some sort of sense of mastery over them. Why does that matter as it intersects with theology then?
Right. So that's kind of the neuroscientific and history of emotion and psychology piece. And then there's the biblical theological piece. So two of the main sources that I used on the Bible's view of emotions were Stephen Forvinda and Matthew Elliott. Matthew Elliott did his doctoral work on feelings in the Bible, and it's an excellent piece. And his main idea is that emotion in the Bible is something that is not, it doesn't go with this universal idea of emotion, but it goes with this cognitive view of emotion, that our emotion comes out of our thinking.
Okay.
And he does a really good job of showing that through the Old Testament and the New Testament, emotion is seen as a cognitive process by a lot of the Bible's writers. So his idea is that God can command emotion, like God can say, love your enemy, because emotion is cognitive. And as we change our thinking, we change the emotions that we construct. So as we become more Christ-like, we're going to feel the emotions like Jesus did. We're going to have the character of God, and that's going to come out in God's compassion, in God's love, in God's anger, in God's sadness. Like, as we are transformed by the Holy Spirit, we begin to have more God-like emotions, because God made us in God's image with emotions. God is emotional. We're emotional. Jesus is shown as being very emotional in the Gospels. So Matthew Elliott traces a lot of that work. And then Stephen Forwinda also looks intensely at Jesus's emotional expressions, all 60-something of them in the Gospels. Goes into great like linguistic and cultural detail about them. And Jesus has this wide range of human emotion that is consistent with the portrait we see of God in the Old Testament, and yet is embodied and is human. So what we get wrong theologically is the idea that we should not be emotional as Christians. We should be emotional because we should be emotional like Jesus. Jesus is emotional. I think the missing piece there is to say there is an element of transformation that needs to come in. Our emotions need to be discipled, just like every aspect of our lives as followers of Jesus. So what some of those, church elders were getting right was that there is a way that God shapes our emotions. But what got wrong was that it meant suppressing or ignoring our emotions.
Okay, so that's the sticking point then, right? It's like, it's because I would say I even heard like a lot of what you just said, maybe not the neuroscience part, but just in general, some of my upbringing would have been nodding their heads and agreeing with. But like, and this is something I talk about a lot on here. It's like there's what you say your theology is, and then there's the way it actually works itself out. And both are like very important. There's like the spoken and the unspoken theology. And it's like whatever was being said about emotions, what was being communicated to so many of us was repress, repress, repress.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you suggesting then, based on the neuroscience, based on theology? What does a Christian's healthy relationship with their emotions look like then?
I think it's what our brother Paul says in Romans, be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Right.
I didn't do Paul in my thesis, I did Jesus, but that verse I think is still key as a concept. It's being aware that as we're transformed into being more Christ-like, that the emotions we construct will change. But also, it's being aware that there is space for our human emotion. Mm-hmm. Jesus didn't go through life as a Stoic. He wasn't a Stoic. He was maybe a Pharisee, and we could get into that whole discussion, but he was a Jewish man. He was not a Greco-Roman philosopher.
Right.
Jesus expressed his emotions openly, and he didn't jump to it's all going to be all right. Like, he didn't spiritually bypass, which is a word I've seen thrown around more, which is a really important term, and I've heard it from a number of different psychologists. Spiritual bypassing. Like, Jesus didn't just say, well, it's God's will, so it's going to be good, or I know it's going to turn out all right in the end, or God's got this. Jesus wept.
Yeah.
Jesus cried. Jesus was angry. Jesus was afraid. That's probably controversial, but we could talk some more about that. Jesus was joyful. And these were not spiritual constructs. These were actual human emotions. And that's another thing that Matthew Elliott points out in his work, that sometimes we over-spiritualize the emotion words in the Bible. And we say, well, joy doesn't really mean the emotion of joy, because how could God command us to be joyful? Joy must mean like a choice to be content even when you're actually feeling sad. No, like joy means joy. It means happiness. Uh-huh. It's a real emotion, and God can say be joyful because God can help us change our thinking to begin to construct more joy as an emotion in our lives.
I mean, so like, for instance, when James says, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you fall into various troubles, I mean, really, it's, if I'm understanding a lot of those passages, it's saying when you understand the reality, not only is that going to change how you're mentally perceiving things, your own emotional world is going to shift to this new reality as well. It's like all of you is going to be transformed.
Yes. And what James is saying there, way before his time, is neuroscientifically valid. Right? Like this is what the science is showing us. Like the way the Bible presents emotion is consistent with the current science.
Which is so opposite, I would say, of how most people perceive the Bible, right? I mean, and maybe to qualify that a little bit, I don't think most people would look at evangelical Christianity or the Bible or whatever and be like, you know who's really got that whole emotion thing pegged. If anything, I feel like evangelicalism has had such a view. There's been such a view of it having repressed emotions. Being very emotionally problematic. So I guess the question is, I know you said like we're believing like this Greco-Roman thing and all that, Stoicism, but how did it get so backwards? Like, why are we so inclined toward fearing this emotional reality?
So I've traced part of it back to the faith and feelings train illustration.
I almost brought that up a couple of minutes back.
Okay, so that's where I've started. So the end of my thesis is I took a stack of books from the past 50 to 70 years of Christian thinking on emotion, and I'm trying to pull out, like, where did this wrong teaching come from? What are the exact quotes that I can pull from it? Spoiler, a lot of it's from James Dobson.
You are not the first person to say that on this podcast.
Elizabeth Elliot and Josh Harris also deserve honorable mention for popularizing some of these ideas. But I think it goes back to, and now I don't remember, was it Navigators or Campus Crusade that had the tract that had the faith and feelings illustration in it. But the idea is it's a series of train cars, and our faith is supposed to be the engine, and our feelings are supposed to be the caboose, and we don't want the caboose driving. But that idea has become very pervasive. Like, we don't want our feelings driving us, we want our faith. But that puts faith and feeling in an unnecessary opposition.
They're adversarial.
Right. It makes them adversarial, and then it makes us as humans adversarial against our own emotions. We have to fight them. We have to fight our emotions instead of learning from our emotions and listening to our emotions and heeding the emotional warning system that God built into us for a reason. Our emotions tell us really important things about what's going on, and our emotions are our own construction and response to what's going on and our prediction of the future. So we should be partnering with our emotions and not fighting against them. So I think
rather than saying just get everything else in your life in line and it'll pull your emotions along, what are you suggesting that someone does? I've got the same thing going on. I've got my kids just...
Anyway, so sorry, you were saying, yeah, it puts our emotions and our faith in opposition, and that's not healthy.
Why is that not healthy?
Because it's not like Jesus. And we want to be like Jesus, and Jesus is emotional. So if we look at Jesus's example in the Gospels, I look at a few specific scenes in detail, and I'd love to do more on it. But if we look at Jesus and Lazarus, for example, that is an incredibly complicated, layered, and nuanced emotional scene, because Jesus he's peaceful, and he's joyful, and he's angry, and he's sad, and he's grieving, and he's frustrated, all in this one scene. But I think one of the key points for this discussion is that before he goes and does the miracle of Lazarus from the dead, he takes time to weep. He feels the loss of his friend. He doesn't bypass that by saying, well, God's going to do a miracle. He weeps with Mary, his dear friend. He has a tense conversation with Martha, his other dear friend. And he enters into their anger, their frustration, their pain, their loss, and he feels his own pain and loss. And there's even potentially his own fear of his own death, which is really coming in just a few days. So it's perhaps he's seeing the finality of Lazarus's death, and he's fearing his own death that's coming, like the finality of death. There's shades of him looking at death as me. He's angry at death, like death with a capital D. Like, there's so much in that scene. The most moving part is that he takes time to weep. And so when we don't allow space for emotion in our own lives or in our Christianity or in our churches, we're failing to be like Jesus, our example, who takes time to weep for himself, but also to weep with his friends. And so we can fail to see that our Jesus is empathetic and wants to weep with us. Like, when we're on the dirt road, like Mary, at his feet saying, where were you? If you had come, my brother wouldn't have died. Like, Jesus is with her, gathering her up on his knees with her, entering inside, hearing it from her. He receives Martha's anger. He receives Mary's sadness. So not only does he like express his own emotion as an example to us and as his own human experience, but like, we miss the fact that our high priest is empathetic and we can go to him with our emotions. He wants to hear them. Jesus doesn't want us to repress and ignore them. He wants us to express them to him.
So good. One of the things, so like several years ago now, I wrote this tiny, calling it a book seems a little too glamorous, but I wrote this tiny little like 5-chapter book thing about the story of Lazarus. And what was shocking to me,
it's in my, I reference it in my thesis.
Ah! Yeah.
I bought it after you mentioned it on Twitter, and it's in my
the thesis. It's a big moment for me. That's so great. Yeah, but one of the things that was shocking to me, shocking, as I was like, so you read the story, and it seems pretty face value of like Jesus is feeling a lot of very identifiable emotions. It's a very comforting story, and then I start reading some theologians, and it was fascinating how many of them wanted to explain away Jesus's emotional responses as being angry at the people for having emotions. And so like when Jesus is weeping, he's weeping out of lack of faith, which I'm just like, what the hell are you talking about? And then it's like,
and Stephen Forwinda like shred those scholars. They think that's totally wrong.
It's stupid. I mean, it's like, it makes no, we have, as you're talking about this, it's stirring up stuff I haven't thought about in a little while, but I think we discount the validity of reading the Bible from a psychological point of view. Like we assume right out of the gate, it doesn't have much to say about emotion and empathy and psychology. And so we just don't read it that way. And when we stumble across things that clearly are that, we try to like get rid of them. And I mean, even like I was thinking about the book of Job and how it's this book that is this like really emotionally intense wrestling with the problem of evil and pain and ends kind of unresolved. And rather than letting that book speak of like maybe the first book that was ever written that's in our, you know, our biblical canon is this incredibly empathetic and long point of view of the suffering of human beings that goes unexplained. And we turned it into like a treatise for Calvinism or something. And I was like, what are we doing?
Well, if we look at the whole picture of the Bible and we're willing to look at it with fresh eyes and say, what does the Bible really say about emotion? And don't read our own preconceived notions of emotional suppression onto the Bible. I think we see a lot of healthy emotion there. So my goal with my work, which hopefully when the thesis is done, I'll turn it into a book, is to help Christians reshape their view of their own emotions and to consider, okay, how can I disciple my emotions as I disciple every other aspect of my life and learn to have a healthy view of my emotions, just like Jesus did? How can my emotions come in line with the emotions of Jesus and his example of expression in the Gospels, which I think is going to be a much healthier approach than don't be sad, don't be angry, always be joyful, by which I put a fake smile on your face, pretend like you don't have any real problems. You know, when you're fearful, it's a lack of faith. Just all of that unhealthy emotional suppression and repression has no place in a vibrant, healthy Christian life. There's room for our pain. There's room for our grief. There's room for our anger. There's room for our fear. There's also room for real joy, real emotional joy. We should expect joy. But there's also there's so much room for human suffering. Like there's space for mental illness. There's space for trauma. There's space for abuse recovery. There's space for the anger of people who are oppressed. We don't have to hide those emotions. In fact, those emotions that cry for justice should emotionally stir us to action, just like it did for Jesus.
And it's too messy for us so often. I
So
mean,
messy.
as you're like, but it's like, but that's life. But like, when I say it's too messy for us, I'm probably speaking as someone who's been in ministry for quite a few years myself. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think we get very concerned, and again, by we, I probably mean pastors, leaders, and churches. We get very concerned by people's experiences that can't be resolved quickly. And it's like, I almost feel like we're worried they are going to those experiences are going to take them off the deep end. Like you said earlier, there is a pastoral fear a lot of times of like, man, I got to do right by this person. And we take it on us. We become the saviors of them, of thinking like, I need to fix this person to make them okay. But really what that ends up turning into a lot of times is we insist on people's worlds being a lot cleaner and simpler than they really are.
Yes. And here's the other piece that what you're saying brings to mind that I touch on in my thesis, but I've forgotten to mention. So often this fear of feelings is a fear of sex.
Let's do it. All right.
There's so much. Okay. So in the literature, the Christian literature, there's so much conflation of emotion with sexual desire.
Yes, 100%.
And so when someone says, don't be led by your feelings, they mean don't be led by your sexual desire and get into sexual sin, because obviously that's the biggest, worst, baddest thing you can do as a Christian is sin sexually. ever could happen. So don't listen to your feelings at all in case you accidentally want to have sex with someone. Like, but like that conflation of desire and emotion is really problematic. So actually one of the first things I did, and I spent like 2 months just working on the chapter of what is an emotion. It's really called, like, how do we define emotion? But I had to differentiate, like, this is desire, this is emotion, and this is feeling. Like, feeling and emotion are not the same word.
Okay.
So you feel your emotions. Yep. Like a feeling is a sensation, right? Like I feel cold, I feel hungry, I'm feeling a sensation. I'm like describing that there's a sensation in my body and I feel it, and then I feel my emotions. Like I feel the physical sensations that go with being happy, or I feel something and my mind is constructing this as nervousness, or my mind is constructing this as hunger, or my mind is constructing this as happiness. So we feel our emotions, but an emotion and a feeling are not the same thing. An emotion is this complicated response to what is going on in my brain and body. Okay. Then desire is simply a want, and desire is not all bad. In fact, desire is not mostly bad, but I feel like in Christian circles, like desire is bad. Like, universally, desire is bad, which goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Like what God wants for me is more important than what I want for me. So if I have a desire, it's probably bad and I shouldn't trust it. I should only desire what God desires for me, which is going to be something I hate and is horrible and makes me miserable. So we have to differentiate all of that. Emotions are not about desire. So I think when we begin to separate that, we can be less afraid of our emotions, because our emotions, by and large, are not going to do what I think those pastors feared, which was lead us into sexual sin.
Sure. And it's like, ironically, the most likely way for those emotions to go haywire and lead someone to destructive behavior would be to tell people to repress them, right?
Right.
And
because
ironically, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. Because then you're dealing with coping behaviors.
Yeah.
And for some people, sex is a coping behavior. So yeah.
Of course. Well, I mean, for me, a big part of my story, I just shared this in the last couple of weeks, but a big part of my story is I had undealt with sexual abuse when I was in 6th grade. Didn't really have words for it and understanding that that's what it was. I hadn't and it wasn't like I was actively even like saying, no, I'm not going to deal with that. It was more of like I didn't know I needed to until my early mid 30s, when it wasn't the only thing causing some self-destructive patterns of behavior, but it had heavily mixed in with some other stuff and nearly blew up my entire life. And it wasn't because I think for so long what I was trying to do is anything I felt or wanted or desired, any of that stuff that was going on, I just immediately said, those are the bad things. They must be pushed down. And all that I really did was just kick the can down the curb. And it's like, but it's more like a snowball. It was just getting bigger. And it's like, because I'd never really been taught to pay attention to my emotional inner world. And so like, yeah,
there's so much of that is a trauma response too. I mean, when we have trauma like childhood sexual abuse, which I've also experienced and had to deal with in trauma therapy, when we're trying to deal with trauma and we're not facing it in a healthy way with the supportive professional who can help us deal with it, in the language of like internal family systems therapy, we create these firefighter parts that are like panicking because these firefighters don't want us to feel the painful memories and experiences. So it's like grab for watching too much TV, binge drinking, risky sexual behavior, too much time on social media. Like those are firefighter behaviors that we do to hide our own pain from ourselves because our body's trying to protect us. Like our body and brain are doing what God designed them to do to protect us from those traumatic memories. But sometimes we choose unhealthy coping behaviors. And instead of, so when you tell someone, don't do those bad behaviors, repress it, we're just making their trauma worse instead of saying, what trauma have you experienced that needs to be healed, that's leading to you thinking you're not worth taking care of?
Mm-hmm.
which is a much more compassionate and pastoral response when we see someone engaging in firefighting behavior.
Yeah, but the problem is that, I mean, how many pastors have been trained? Not forget trained. How many pastors have even experienced that themselves? I'm pretty actively convinced at this point that most of the people, and maybe this is changing and kind of the generation younger than us that's coming up, I hope so, but I think there is like decades of people in pastoral ministry who have never, ever, ever, ever been taught what to do with their inner world.
Yeah.
And so, of course, their theology and their preaching and the church cultures they create are just going to be these repressive cultures. And it's not because anyone's trying to do it. They're just these emotionally stunted people who never knew it was okay just to like be sad sometimes.
Yeah. See, I think every pastor needs to have a therapist, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, I do.
I see my therapist every week, so I think it's important.
Yeah. So actually, before I get to that, we'll end with kind of the, so what do we do part of it. But before we get there, one of the things that we just talked about it a bit, and I'd like to unpack it a little bit more, is talking about sexual abuse in the church. So how does that all intersect for you of that topic and this emotional world that we're talking about and your passion for the church?
Wow, big answer. My dream someday is to help lead a trauma-informed church.
Yeah.
Like a church that is specifically crafted to be safe for people who've experienced, especially spiritual abuse, but also all other forms of abuse, where all of the pastors would be trauma trained and trauma informed and be aware of emotional health and would make church, I think, what Jesus wants it to be, which is a safe place for the most vulnerable people to come.
What are some of the behaviors that a sexual abuse survivor might be demonstrating that a church is going to see as being like problematic?
Talking about it, for starters. Some churches would prefer that people just not talk about it, especially if it's, an allegation against someone in leadership in the church.
Mm-hmm.
To sweep that under the carpet. But even if it's talking about abuse that happened elsewhere, some people are really uncomfortable with it and just don't want it to be talked about in church. So just talking about abuse in general or abuse in specific makes some church leaders really uncomfortable. But victims may have trauma responses. So they might be hypervigilant, or easily startle, or have really strong self-defense mechanisms. So immediately getting really reactive or defensive can be a trauma response.
Mm-hmm.
Or freaking up and shutting down and performing a role to try to be the perfect person to be accepted is also a trauma response. Or running away,
mm-hmm.
freezing or fleeing or fighting are all trauma responses.
Mm-hmm.
So what could be considered emotional outbursts? If someone is triggered, say someone's triggered in a small group meeting by something someone says or by a smell or a memory that comes up, and they have an emotional reaction that seems disproportionate to the stimulus,
mm-hmm.
That's very often an indicator of trauma.
Yeah.
But it's very easy for church leaders to write off that person as overly emotional.
Or disobedient.
Or disobedient, or a wild child, instead of taking that as I wonder if this person has trauma in their history that we can help be compassionate and help them heal from. Because someone who's experiencing a trauma reaction can't distinguish the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. And they might have a response to something that's not actually threatening, but to them it feels threatening. And so that trauma is very real, and that threat is very real in their brain. So someone who, mouths off or has an emotional outburst, gets angry or gets sad or bursts into tears, sometimes that can all indicate that there's been abuse there. I've also seen people misreading abusive relationships. Reading a thread on Twitter the other day about a pastor's wife who was shaming a young woman for not wearing modest enough clothing in a church service.
Sure.
and after 3 times, like, kicked the girl out of the church, and then was complaining that a few months later the girl turned up pregnant. Well, the reason she turned up pregnant was because her stepfather raped her, and she got pregnant from that. So, like, the whole time, like, she was in this abusive household.
Yeah.
And what she needed from the church was protection and not being shunned for what she was wearing and not being blamed for getting pregnant when it was sexual abuse. Like, there's so many things wrong with that scenario that makes you want to.
Yeah, there's a few things wrong there. What you're describing, I mean, first of all, it's just infuriating, that one story, and it makes you want to kind of burn the world down a little bit. I'm like, this shall not happen again. But I also am thinking right now about, probably some of the people that I've found myself connecting with on social media. I think in a lot of ways are people who, they may not have experienced abuse, although a lot of them I'm sure have, in the same way that both you and I have shared stories of abuse. But I have a feeling if everyone who is watching this or listening to this, if we were to hear their story, I bet a lot of them would have stories of their emotional realities just being too much for churches to handle. And so what is someone, maybe, because I've been asking a lot of questions that have been more from like a pastoral point of view, just for people who are trying to figure out this whole Jesus thing. Like, what do we do with our emotional worlds when they seem to be, when we're not sure how acceptable they are to God?
I would say you cannot be too emotional for Jesus. There's no such thing as being too emotional for Jesus. Jesus himself has wild, full, expressive emotion, and Jesus welcomes hearing that from us. Jesus has suffered everything that we've suffered, and he knows how we feel. And that's the first reality, is that the amazing thing about an incarnated God, an embodied God, is that not only did God create us in God's image, but then God entered into that created image in Jesus. And so Jesus knows exactly what human emotion feels like and what human suffering feels like. So our anger, our sadness, our fear, our jealousy, our frustration, and our happiness, our contentment, our joy, our laughter, Jesus knows all of that. He's physically experienced it all. And Jesus mediates that into, that's getting way too complicated theological language. Let's talk about the mediation of Christ, but maybe not right now. Like, I don't want to start like quoting T.F. Torrance. That's a little much. Jesus knows what it feels like to be human because he is human and he's God. And so what we can know about Jesus is that he welcomes our full emotionality.
And I think it's that welcome, right? Because I think I was taught that Jesus entered into all of that stuff. I think, and I don't know if this was ever said, but I definitely kind of had this impression of like, he did all that. He got into all of our messy human stuff because it was problematic, and now he wants us to get past it. And it's not just that he understands it; it's that he understands the validity of it, right? I mean, it's not just empathizing to get us past it. It's teaching us how to correctly experience the emotion, if I'm hearing what you're saying, right?
Yes. And I always want to be careful with language. I haven't figured out the right way to say it, like that correctly experiencing our emotion.
Yeah, even as I said it, I didn't like it.
I don't want to put a burden on people when I'm repeating Dr. Feldman Barrett and saying, you are the architect of your own emotional experience. Like, right. I'm not trying to put a burden on people saying, well, you're responsible to fix all your emotions because you're in control of how you construct emotion. Like, that's not the point of that. It's just that it's really true that as we change our thinking and our cultural inputs and our language around emotion, it really does change how our brain creates emotion, how our brain interprets our body's sensations to make meaning out of it and to call that an emotion. Like, making meaning out of our body's sensations is what emotion is. So I think that Jesus changes our reality and helps us make new meaning and helps us make new emotion. And as far as Jesus wanting us to get over it, yeah, that's such a flawed idea, because I think we don't have to look any further than Jesus standing on the dirt road outside Bethany, listening to Martha's anger and then getting down in the dirt and weeping with Mary. Just that right there is, I think, what Jesus wants us to do with our emotions, is to openly vent them to him and to receive the comfort of the Holy Spirit.
Right. I mean, it's almost like, rather than emotions, the if there's something that someone walks away from this interview with, I kind of would hope it would be that our emotions aren't this roadblock or obstacle to the presence of God. They're actually like a pathway to him.
Yes.
It's like it's an on-ramp. It's like, you see that as you were saying all that, I was like, yeah, like what you see throughout the Bible is the most intense and sometimes maybe even like arguably inappropriate, like in the Psalms, where it's like, Lord, take my enemies' babies and throw them off a cliff so they can bash their heads on the rocks or whatever. You're like, I don't know how I feel about that sentiment.
I love imprecatory Psalms so much.
Right. Because, rather than me say it, why do you love imprecatory Psalms that involve that kind of lamenting, that suffering, that shaking your fist? Why do you love that?
Because I think that the lamenting Psalms show us an emotional roadmap or a path for our emotional expression. It's to say, here's where I'm really truly at in all its honesty. And I can freely say that to God. Like the Psalms show us, we can freely express our lament to God. And then they walk us through a cognitive change where we remind ourselves of God's goodness and God's reality and God's hope for us, God's salvation, and the deliverance that we long for. And through the Psalms, we walk this path of, we see the cognitive change in the psalmist to where by the end of the psalm, they're saying, yet I will praise you, or, why are you so downcast, my soul? Put your hope in God. Yeah. So it walks us through that whole, like, be honest, remember the truth, let God change your perspective, and it will actually change the emotion that your brain is constructing.
But it's not, there's stuff that I'm just realizing now for the very first time. But it's not even that we read those Psalms to teach us how to get rid of certain feelings to get us to the other feelings. God does that. We bring the emotion to God, and then we watch that is okay, and that God meets us in that and takes us somewhere. But it's not our job to even come in and be like, all right, God, I've got this emotion, I need it fixed. It's more we just let that emotion bring us into the presence of God, and then whatever happens after that's kind of like what happens. Like it's more, it's because, like, how relationally intimate can we really be with anyone if we're not being honest about our emotional reality, right?
Right. Yes. There's emotional intimacy in the Psalms and in the Gospels, in the conversations Jesus has with some of the disciples about their emotions. There's emotional honesty in Jesus's relation to God the Father. I mean, we didn't even get into Gethsemane, but there is so much there about Jesus's honest expression of his emotion to the Father in Gethsemane and saying, I don't want to do this. Is there any other way? I'm hurting. I'm scared. I don't want to. There's so much about emotion and obedience that we could go into there. But Jesus even sets that example. Be honest with God about your emotion, and it's God that does the transforming work.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay, we got to start wrapping up here. I have like a million other things I want to talk to you about, but I'm going to stop it for now. So I do want to end with a couple of questions that I ask every guest that we have on here. The first one is this, and I think you kind of already answered it a few minutes back. In some ways, you've been answering it for the last hour, but why is God better than we think?
Oh, I love that question. Why is God better than we think?
Mm-hmm.
Because God is good. That feels like such a lame answer, but what I'm quoting John Mark McMillan. Yeah. John Mark McMillan wrote a song. I will probably cry because the song means so much to me. How He Loves, and it's become so popular. We sing it in our churches, but we leave out his third verse, which he wrote the song the day after his best friend died. Yeah. And it's not church singable, but it's emotional, and I love it. And if you find the original recording, he breaks down in the studio, and they kept it because it's so powerful. But he says, I thought about you, God, the day Stephen died, and you met me between my breaking. And I know that I still love you, God, despite the agony. Seb, people will try to say that you're cruel, but if Stephen could sing, he'd say it's not true because you're good. And his voice breaks and he breaks down, and it's incredibly powerful. I was just thinking of that song myself the other day. Yeah. God meets us in our breaking, and God is not cruel, but God is good. And that's why God is so much better than we think, because he doesn't turn us away when we're breaking, but he's the safest place to be when we're breaking.
Yeah, that just has Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I'm just realizing in this interview how far I am still from just bringing the honest, emotional version of myself to God. It's years of training otherwise are hard to shake. It's hard to fight that, like, my emotions are unacceptable, I shall hide them. Thank you so much for this. Okay. For our still recovering from that. Okay. For the people who are watching or listening to this who are so inclined, how can we be praying for you?
Oh, that's a really good question too. Thank you. I think that big question mark. I don't know why I'm here.
Yeah.
I don't know. I loved where I was living. I loved what I was doing. It was hard to leave. But yet I'm so happy to be here. I'm so excited. I'm full of anticipation of what God's going to do. I just don't know what it is. And so I'm like I said, I'm an Enneagram 8. Like, I'm a planner. I'm a take charge kind of person, and I don't know what's next. And so just sort of waiting. I think healing a lot, resting a lot is what God has me doing right now. But I'm just curious what the next step is, and waiting for God to open that door.
Thank you for that. Appreciate the honesty there. But I mean, you talk about emotional honesty, so you kind of have to be, right? So if someone's watching this thing, like, I need more of Becky in my life, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I would love it if you bought the book I did with Dr. Scott McKnight called Following King Jesus, which is available on Amazon and other booksellers from Zondervan. It's a 20-week discipleship workbook where we look at Jesus in a lot of different ways and elements. And there's a lot of good emotional honesty stuff in there as we look at the Gospels and Jesus's life and what it means to be an authentic follower of Jesus. And then you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, both at @BCastleMiller. Now that I'm like settled here, I'll get a website up eventually for myself. But Instagram is like the best daily look into my life. Twitter's where I do a lot of my like advocacy causes I care about work. If you're interested in a more academic book, I did a study guide to Scott McKnight's Reading Romans Backwards called Teaching Romans Backwards.
I saw that.
So if you want a companion book to study Romans, I did the study guide for that. And then hopefully in the next couple of years, I'll have a book out on Jesus and emotions and discipleship. So be looking for that.
Yeah. Becky, we'll keep talking here in a second after I stop recording, and people can just wonder what it is we talked about. But I do want to say, while everyone's still watching or listening, how grateful I am for you and the work you're doing, and how appreciative I personally am of just, it matters. The stuff runs core to my heart for so many personal reasons, and I'm just grateful that you're out there doing it. So thank you.
Thanks so much. This was fun. Thank you.